Shaq was just stopping by the bank when he saw a teenage girl being humiliated for holding a check with his name on it. The manager laughed in her face. Security was called. People whispered. But Shaq didn't raise his voice. He raised the stakes. What he did next flipped the entire bank upside down, and the internet couldn't look away. Stay till the end, because this story, it's about to blow your mind. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. This line is for account holders only, Miss Pratt snapped, her tone dripping with superiority as her eyes scanned the teenage girl like she was a mistake. Zaria froze for half a second, the envelope clutched tight in her hand. She stood at the front of the gleaming marble floor lobby of Belridge Private Bank, a place where the chairs looked more expensive than anything she owned. Dressed in simple jeans and a hoodie, she was already getting stares, but she didn't flinch. "I have an account," Zaria said, voice calm but firm, "and my ID." Ms. Pratt, early 40s, platinum blonde bob, sharp blazer, let out a short, mocking laugh. "Of course you do. And let me guess, that envelope has $1 million check inside?" Zaria didn't respond. She simply placed the envelope on the counter. Ms. Pratt didn't touch it. Instead, she turned slightly, speaking just loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. "We've had a lot of creative forgeries lately, people trying to pull stunts." A few chuckles. One man in a suit smirked. Another looked away uncomfortable. Zaria didn't move. "It's not a stunt. I'm depositing a check. That's all." Ms. Pratt sighed dramatically and leaned closer. "Sweetheart, this is a private bank. You can't just waltz in here with a piece of paper and think." She stopped mid-sentence as Zaria pulled out her ID, laying it next to the envelope. "You can verify both. Or are you trained to assume I'm lying because of how I look?" A moment of silence. Ms. Pratt blinked. Then, without even opening the envelope, she scoffed. "You look suspicious. And if you don't step aside, I'll call security." Customers shifted awkwardly. A woman near the front started recording on her phone. Zaria's jaw clenched. But she didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. Instead, she leaned in slowly, her eyes locked onto Ms. Pratt's. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly. "Every second of it." Ms. Pratt rolled her eyes and reached for the phone behind the counter. "Let's not make a scene," she muttered, though it was already far too late. Zaria stepped back, crossing her arms. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear, from something else. Just then, the lobby doors swung open, and a familiar towering silhouette stepped in, shadow falling across the floor. "Security now!" Ms. Pratt snapped her fingers like she was ordering a latte. Within seconds, two uniformed guards, Rob and Tina, stepped out from the side hallway. Rob, stocky and silent, cracked his knuckles as he eyed Zaria. Tina, taller and younger, looked unsure as her eyes scanned the growing crowd of customers, watching everything unfold. Zaria didn't flinch. With a steady hand, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her ID, and placed it gently on the counter beside the envelope. Tina stepped forward and picked it up. Her brows furrowed as she looked from the ID to Zaria, then slowly slid open the envelope. The moment she read the check inside, Tina's face went pale. "This is from Shaquille O'Neal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Customers leaned in. Someone gasped. Phones were now definitely recording. Ms. Pratt scoffed loudly and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on, that's not real. You expect me to believe Shaq is just handing out five-figure checks to teenagers?" "It's real," Zaria said, her voice even, her posture steady. "He's my mentor." Tina looked torn. "This signature, it looks verified. I think it's obviously fake," Ms. Pratt snapped. "I've seen scams like this before. Designer envelopes, fake IDs, people like her trying to game the system." Zaria's jaw clenched, but she stayed silent. A middle-aged man in a suit near the line muttered, "That's enough." His phone was already pointed toward the scene. Another woman whispered to her friend, "She gave her ID. Why aren't they checking it?" The tension was boiling now, air thick with disbelief, confusion, and something uglier. Zaria stood still, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Ms. Pratt like she'd been through worse, and survived it. Tina turned to Rob. "We should verify this before making a scene." Ms. Pratt rolled her eyes. "I am the assistant manager. I don't need your permission to call the cops." Rob hesitated but stepped forward. And then, a deep, commanding voice boomed from behind them. "That check's real. Now who's got a problem with it?" Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, Dressed in black and 10 feet of calm fury was Shaquille O'Neal himself. The bank falls silent as Shaq enters, cool, calm, and angry. For a few seconds, the bank lobby felt frozen in time. The steady hum of conversation, the clicking of keyboards, and even the air conditioning seemed to fall silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance. There, standing tall in a black hoodie and tailored jeans, was a man everyone instantly recognized. Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, business mogul. And right now, he didn't look pleased. Shaq didn't say a word at first. He simply walked across the polished marble floor with slow, deliberate steps. His towering 7 feet 1 inch frame moved with calm purpose, like a storm gathering beneath the surface. The tension in the room thickened with every step. When he reached Zaria, who was still standing near the security desk with the check in hand, he stopped and offered a gentle fist bump. She met it without hesitation, the tiniest smile flickering on her lips. She looked like she'd been holding her breath, and now she could finally exhale. Rob and Tina, the two security guards, took an unconscious step back. They exchanged uncertain glances. Whatever this was, it had just escalated way beyond their pay grade. From behind the glass door, Ms. Pratt returned from the back office, clearly expecting the issue to be over by now. She took one look at Shaq and froze mid-step, her face draining of color. The smugness she'd worn earlier evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. She tried to recover quickly, plastering on a forced smile. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize you were—" Shaq cut her off without raising his voice. "She told you whose check it was, but you didn't listen." Miss Pratt opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence from the other customers was deafening. Phones were raised, cameras were recording. Everyone could feel it. This moment was about to go viral. "I see what happened here," Shaq continued, turning slightly so his voice carried through the room. "It wasn't the check you had a problem with. It was the person holding it." Murmurs rippled across the lobby. A few people nodded. Others looked away, ashamed they hadn't said anything sooner. Then Shaq slowly turned to face the growing crowd. "You all saw what just happened, right?" Every camera in the room kept rolling. But Shaq, he was just getting started. Every phone in the room is recording now. Ms. Pratt panics. The soft hum of the bank lobby had transformed into a charged silence, broken only by the faint clicks of recording phones. Dozens of hands held them high, capturing every second. Ms. Pratt stood frozen behind the counter, her confidence cracking as she saw the glowing screens pointed her way. Shaq turned to face the lobby, his voice calm but commanding. "This right here," he said, gesturing toward Zaria, "is what discrimination looks like. It's not always loud. Sometimes it comes dressed in a pressed blazer with a fake smile." Zaria stood quietly beside him, her jaw clenched, eyes still locked on Ms. Pratt. Miss Pratt took a nervous step forward, forcing a laugh. "Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I was just doing my job." Someone near the back muttered, "Yeah, sure you were." Then a woman near the front, maybe in her 40s, raised her voice clear and direct. "Nah, you saw her skin before you saw her ID." The tension in the room shifted from awkward silence to collective realization. Heads nodded. More murmurs followed. Even the guards, Rob and Tina, looked down, uncomfortable. Ms. Pratt's voice wavered. "It was a misunderstanding. You have to understand. We see fraud every day." "Then why didn't you even look at the check?" someone snapped. Before she could stammer out another excuse, a new voice cut through the noise. "What is going on here?" The crowd parted as a tall man in a gray suit stepped out from the back offices. The branch manager. His name tag read Mr. Eldridge, and the confusion on his face turned to dread the moment he laid eyes on Shaq. His steps slowed. His eyes flicked from the cameras to Zaria, to Ms. Pratt, and finally to Shaq, whose arms were now crossed, his stare sharp as steel. "Mr. O'Neal," the manager muttered, his voice dry as sand. "I wasn't aware—" Shaq interrupted with a calm, deep tone. "You are now." Ms. Pratt's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Her face had turned a pale shade of panic. Everyone in the room could feel it. Something big was about to happen. The manager's gaze swept across the room full of phones, then landed on Zaria's face. That's when he realized this wasn't just a bad incident. This was a viral disaster waiting to explode. The manager rushes to smooth things over, but Shaq isn't having it. Mr. Eldridge stepped forward like a man walking into a storm. His smile was tight, forced, every inch of him trying to project calm. Mr. O'Neill, I sincerely apologize on behalf of the bank. This is clearly a misunderstanding. Let's move to my office. I can offer Miss Zaria here, VIP service, expedited. Processing, refreshments, whatever she needs. Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. His eyes burned a hole through Eldridge's corporate shield. No, Shaq said flatly. What she needed was basic respect, not some panic-polished apology after you realized you were on camera. Zaria stood behind him, silent but steel-spine. Her eyes scanned the room, still full of people filming, whispering, some shaking their heads, others simply watching history unfold. The manager's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Of course, of course. You're right, and I take full responsibility. Shaq cut in, his voice low and cutting. Do you, though? Because if you trained your staff right, she wouldn't have been treated like a criminal for walking in with a check. Instead, your assistant manager humiliated a young girl, tried to call security on her, and didn't even glance at the paperwork. Ms. Pratt, who had been standing stiff behind the counter, suddenly snapped. Her voice cracked from the pressure. I didn't know she was important. The words dropped like a bomb. The entire room froze. A beat of silence and then a gasp rolled through the crowd like a wave. Tina, still standing to the side, whispered just loud enough. Wow. She said the quiet part out loud. Even Rob shook his head, stepping a foot away from Ms. Pratt. Zaria's lip trembled for half a second, but she held it, composed, still. The weight of every time she'd been underestimated hung in the air. She didn't need to speak. The moment spoke for itself. Mr. Eldridge looked like he'd just swallowed glass. Ms. Pratt, please. No, Shaq said, pulling out his phone. His tone dropped to something colder. Final. You know what? I'm calling someone. The manager's brows lifted. Mr. O'Neill, let's not escalate this. We can resolve it here. Shaq tapped his screen and raised the phone to his ear. No, he said again, glancing at Zaria, because clearly, fixing this at your level isn't enough. As the phone rang, Shaq looked back at Ms. Pratt, who now looked pale, hollow. Let's see what your regional VP thinks about how you treat young black girls with ambition. Shaq makes one call, and things move fast. The phone rang only once before a voice answered. Deep, professional, director. Shaq, you don't usually call during business hours, the man said with a half-joking tone. Shaq didn't smile. Michael, I need you to listen carefully. He hit speaker, holding the phone out so the entire bank lobby could hear. The tension in the room thickened, like fog. I'm standing in your West Side branch, Shaq began, his voice measured but sharp, where a teenage girl holding a check with my signature on it was treated like a criminal, humiliated, doubted, publicly insulted. There was silence on the line. Then, you're kidding me. No, Shaq replied. And the assistant manager, she just said, and I quote, I didn't know she was important. A low curse slipped from the speaker. Put me on with the branch manager, right now. Mr. Eldridge stepped forward, visibly sweating. He gave a weak wave toward the phone like it could somehow fix this mess. Michael, good afternoon. This is Eldridge. I assure you, we're handling the situation. No, you're not, the VP snapped. If Shaq's calling me, then you're already too late. I want a full report ready when I get there. I'm en route now. 35 minutes. If that girl's check hasn't been verified and deposited by the time I walk in, you're in deeper trouble than you can imagine. Eldridge fumbled for words, his face draining of color. Meanwhile, Ms. Pratt had inched her way toward the hallway, head low, hoping the chaos might give her a chance to vanish unnoticed. But Tina saw her and stepped in her path with arms crossed. Not today, she said coldly. Across the lobby, Zaria still stood holding her check. She hadn't moved a muscle. Her shoulders were still square, her jaw tight, but her eyes were on Shaq, watching, processing. Shaq ended the call and slipped his phone back into his jacket. He turned toward her, his voice softer now. Steady. Zaria, he said, you good if this gets even bigger? For a moment she didn't speak. Then her fingers curled tightly around the check, and she gave the smallest nod, a flicker of fire behind her calm. I didn't start this, she said, but I'm not backing down. Shaq smiled. Good, because now the whole country's about to know your name. Within an hour, the internet erupts. By the time Zaria sat down to wait in the corner of the lobby, her face calm but her fingers still gripping the check like a lifeline, The outside world had already started watching. One customer uploaded the footage to TikTok with the caption, "Black teen denied at luxury bank." Then Shaq walks in. Within 15 minutes, it had over 300,000 views. By the time the clock hit the hour, it had hit 1 million. On Twitter, the video began trending with a single brutal hashtag, #Bank Karen. "I was just there," one tweet read. "This girl handled herself like a queen. That manager? Straight up racist." Instagram pages that normally posted memes were now sharing split-screen shots of Zaria's calm face and Ms. Pratt's sneer. Thousands of comments poured in. "This is why representation matters. Zaria is her. Ms. Pratt better find a new zip code." Inside the branch, unaware of just how viral things had become, the energy continued to shift. Customers who'd once glanced away now looked at Zaria with something like awe. Even Rob, the guard who'd first followed Ms. Pratt's lead, stood near Zaria protectively now, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room. The lobby was tense, quiet, until it wasn't. Knock, knock, heads turned. The doors to the branch flew open, and in walked a sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit, flanked by 2 assistants and a camera crew trailing close behind. It was Michael Lattimore, the regional VP, and he didn't look happy. His eyes swept the room, landing on Shaq first. The two exchanged a brief nod. No smiles, just mutual understanding. Then his gaze shifted to Zaria, who stood tall despite the weight of a million online eyes. Finally, Michael looked to the trembling manager and the scattered employees still scrambling to process the chaos. But Ms. Pratt? Gone. Someone had seen her slip into the break room moments before the VP arrived, like a shadow retreating from its own mess. Michael's jaw tightened. "Where is she?" he asked coldly. The silence in the room stretched taut like a drawn bowstring. Then louder, his voice rang out like judgment itself. "Find her! Now!" Behind the break room door, Ms. Pratt's trembling hand covered her mouth. But it was too late. Her reckoning had arrived, and the world was watching. Ms. Pratt is dragged back into the lobby, and everyone's watching. The break room door creaked open, and 2 employees escorted Ms. Pratt back into the lobby. Her face was pale, mascara smudged, and the confidence she once wore like armor had completely evaporated. All eyes locked on her. Phones rose again. There was no escape now. Michael Lattimore, the VP, stood waiting in the center of the room like a judge at the gallows. "Explain yourself," he said flatly, gesturing to the sea of stunned customers and the girl she had tried to humiliate. Ms. Pratt's voice trembled. I didn't know who she was. She didn't look like—" She stopped herself, realizing her own words were hanging her. Too late. "You didn't know who she was," Michael repeated. "You saw a young black girl and assumed her check was fake?" "No, I just followed protocol," she insisted. "She looked suspicious." A slow murmur rippled through the crowd like a coming storm. Shaq stepped forward, his presence a wall of calm fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "She didn't doubt the check," he said, his voice deep and cutting. "She doubted the girl." Ms. Pratt opened her mouth to defend herself, but Michael raised his hand. "Stop." He turned to the crowd. "You've all seen the video. You know what happened here." Zaria stood silently, still clutching her check, the envelope now creased in her hand. Her face was unreadable, stoic, but not cold, just tired. Tired of being questioned. Tired of proving herself. Michael looked at Ms. Pratt with finality. "You're placed on immediate suspension. Corporate will be in touch regarding further action." There was no applause, no cheers, just a deep, satisfied silence. Ms. Pratt gasped, reaching for any lifeline. "But this isn't fair." Zaria finally spoke, her voice calm but sharp as glass. "Neither was what you did to me." The VP nodded toward Zaria. "She's right, and it's time we did better." For the first time, Shaq crouched beside Zaria, not as a celebrity, but as someone who understood the weight she carried. He spoke low, just to her. "You want justice?" he asked. "Or something bigger?" Zaria glanced at the crowd, at the cameras, at the trembling woman who once looked down on her, then back at Shaq. Her next move would change everything. For the first time, Zaria takes control of the moment. The room waited. The crowd, once buzzing with shock and outrage, now fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Shaq looked at Zaria, his towering frame offering quiet support beside her. "Say what you want," he said, his voice low and steady. "Everyone's listening." Zaria looked around. Dozens of faces, phones still recording, reporters pressed against the glass outside. Her heart thudded in her chest like a drum, but her hands didn't shake anymore. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, past Shaq, past the VP, and directly in front of the counter where just minutes ago she'd been dismissed. When I walked in here, she began, her voice clear but soft, I knew exactly what was going to happen, because it's happened before. Eyes widened, heads turned. I came in with ID, a legit check, everything I needed, but it wasn't enough, she said, locking eyes with Ms. Pratt, who stood off to the side like a shadow trying to disappear. Because people like me, black kids, aren't supposed to have money. We're not supposed to walk into fancy banks unless we're mopping the floors or asking for a loan we probably won't get. Her voice grew stronger with each word, like a tide rising. We get questioned, watched, doubted, even when we do everything right. A man in the crowd lowered his phone. A woman clutched her chest, eyes glassy. Zoraya turned to the VP. I'm not here for revenge. I don't need someone fired just to make a headline. I want something better. I want change. She paused. I want training so this doesn't happen to the next Zaria. I want policies that protect people who don't look rich enough to be here. And I want accountability, not just today, but going forward. The VP, moved by her composure, stepped up to the mic. You have my word. We'll launch a full DEI initiative starting this week. Every employee will go through mandatory bias training, starting with me. The crowd nodded, many whispering, finally, under their breath. Shaq approached slowly, pride flickering in his eyes. He leaned down, his voice just for her. What you did? That's bigger than justice. Then he whispered something into her ear. Zaria's eyes widened. She gasped. She turned to him, mouth open. Are you serious? She asked. But Shaq only smiled and gave her a wink. Whatever he said, it wasn't just powerful. It was life-changing. Zaria's tears turned into shock as Shaq pulled something from his jacket. Zaria wiped the corner of her eye, still recovering from the firestorm of emotions her speech had stirred. The room stood quiet, filled with tension, admiration, and anticipation. Just when it felt like the moment had peaked, Shaq reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The rustle of fabric was soft, but it pulled every eye toward him. He pulled out a long, sealed white envelope. No logo, no fanfare, just clean and simple. He held it out to Zaria, her brow furrowed. What's this? Shaq gave her a small smile. Something that should have been in your hands a long time ago. She took the envelope with trembling fingers, slowly breaking the seal. Inside was a formal letter on heavy cardstock, embossed with gold trim. Her eyes scanned the first line and then widened. She read aloud in disbelief. Full academic scholarship, all 4 years. Room, board, books, covered? The crowd collectively gasped. Shaq nodded. College was never going to be a question for you. You earned this the moment you started grinding for your future. I was just waiting for the right time to drop it. Zaria's jaw quivered. Her hand flew to her mouth. For a long second, she didn't move. Then suddenly, she lunged forward and threw her arms around him. The applause erupted like a wave. Customers clapped. The VP wiped away a tear. Even the security guards, Rob and Tina, were smiling. But not everyone was moved. Across the lobby, Ms. Pratt stood stiff, her arms crossed, her face drained of color. Her eyes locked on the scholarship letter like it was a dagger. The manager beside her looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Zaria finally pulled back from the hug, blinking up at Shaq. I don't even know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Shaq replied. You already said everything that mattered. The camera flashes returned. Reporters whispered to producers. The internet outside the glass doors was already exploding with updates. Then Shaq turned to the VP. One more thing, he said, adjusting his cufflinks as if preparing for a business deal. I have one more request, he said calmly. But there was a glint in his eyes that told everyone in the room. This next part might be even bigger. Shaq wants to make sure this never happens again. Shaq took one step forward, adjusting the lapel of his blazer like he was about to enter a boardroom. Not a bank lobby buzzing with reporters and flashing lights. His voice cut through the chatter. I've got one more thing to ask, he said, turning to the VP, who straightened immediately, sensing something big was coming. The VP nodded. Of course, anything. Shaq pointed to Zaria, who stood near the teller's counter still holding the scholarship letter in her hands. There are thousands of kids just like her, smart, ambitious, driven, but they don't have access to banks like this or people who believe in them. The room fell quiet again. Even the cameras seemed to pause. I want this branch, he continued, and every branch you got, to create a program just for them. A youth banking account for underserved teens, financial literacy, support, resources. The VP blinked, then looked around at the gathered crowd and media crews. He didn't hesitate. We'll do it. Effective immediately. Shaq didn't smile. Yet. One more thing, he added, glancing towards Zaria. She's the face of it. The room erupted. Applause, cheers. Tina, the security guard, even let out a, "Let's go!" Zaria turned towards Shaq, her mouth slightly open. Me? Shaq grinned now. No better ambassador. You earned this, not just today, but every day you kept showing up when the world told you not to. The VP leaned over to a nearby assistant, whispering something, and the press shifted their focus. Cameras zoomed in as Shaq and Zaria shook hands, a symbolic moment captured in 1,000 frames across social media. Outside the bank, people gathered on the sidewalk began cheering as live news crews broadcast the moment. A reporter's voice echoed from a nearby speaker. A new chapter in corporate accountability, led by none other than Shaquille O'Neal and a teenage girl who refused to back down. But while the spotlight burned bright on them, in the background, something else unfolded. Ms. Pratt, shoulders hunched, eyes low, was quietly escorted out a side door by security. No applause, no cameras, just silence. She passed Zaria on the way out, but the girl never even looked in her direction. As the press surged forward, Zaria turned toward the nearest camera. Her eyes were steady now, confident, fierce. I'm just getting started, she said. And the world? It was finally listening. Weeks later, Zaria's face is everywhere, and Ms. Pratt's is nowhere. The skyline of downtown beamed with bright LED billboards, but one image stood out above the rest. There she was, Zaria, 17, smiling in a crisp blazer, arms confidently crossed, under bold white letters that read, "Bank on your future," powered by Zaria, sponsored by Shaquille O'Neal. Across the country, her story had exploded into a cultural moment. Within weeks, Zaria became the symbol of hope, resilience, and real change. She wasn't just the girl who got humiliated in a bank lobby. She was now the face of a nationwide youth banking initiative. From financial literacy workshops to school talks and keynote conferences, Zaria was booked, heard, and finally respected. Her words echoed in gymnasiums, auditoriums, and news broadcasts. When the world says you don't belong, you remind it why you do. Meanwhile, Ms. Pratt had disappeared completely. No apology, no press statement, no job. She'd been fired the same day the viral clip hit 10 million views. An internal memo leaked that said she had violated the core values of trust, inclusion, and professionalism. Her name was never mentioned again. In the age of the internet, she had become what she once made Zaria feel like, invisible. But Zaria, she kept rising. Inside a massive conference hall packed with over 1,000 students and young entrepreneurs. She stood on stage, a spotlight casting a warm glow over her braids and bold stance. Sitting in the front row, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, was Shaq. Arms folded, smiling with pride like a big brother watching his little sister graduate. When it was Zaria's turn to speak, the room went still. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be here, she began, her voice steady and grounded. I didn't think a bank would ever use my face for anything other than suspicion. Laughter rippled lightly, but the emotion underneath it was raw. She paused, scanning the sea of young faces. But that day, I learned that speaking up, even when your voice shakes, matters. Because I wasn't just cashing a check, I was cashing in every moment someone doubted me. The crowd leaned in closer. I was told to leave. I stayed. I was told I didn't belong. I proved I do. And now I stand here not just as someone who got justice, but as someone helping others claim theirs. The auditorium erupted. Standing ovation, flashbulbs, cheers. As the lights dimmed and the crowd roared, Zaria glanced over at Shaq. He nodded once, slow and proud. She turned back to the mic, smiling wide. I didn't just cash a check that day. I cashed in my voice. And this time, the world was ready to hear her.